So now let's talk about put and patch. So typically when you want to update a resource through a REST API, you would use the put method to do this. So let's go over to Fiddler and just sort of craft this so we can see. The put method would allow you to take a specific diary entry, let's say 15. We could go ahead and craft the JSON that represents the update we want to make. But the spec is very specific about put. It expects the put to be the entire object. So that means we would have had to retrieve the object, made our changes, and then put the entire object back, which is probably fine. But in the case of ours, we want to also support partial updates. But really, the only thing we're allowing them to update is the quantity, and so in our case, it's actually the same in either case. So let's go ahead and implement the method for it. Back on the controller, we can create a public method. We're going to return a response message as usual. And we could certainly do put, take in the standard date time ID, and in this case we're going to need the ID for the individual object we're changing, because we're talking about supporting change on an individual resource, in this case a diary entry. We're also going to need the actual content from the body of the message. This is going to be a diary entry model. This is going to be the new data that we're going to update it with. Let's go ahead and play catch up with our try catch. Just using some editor inheritance there to do the same thing. We can go ahead and implement the put here. The reality is for our case, because we're only asking for what can be updated, in our case, the quantity, put may not be the right thing, because if we're going to implement it by the spec, only allow us to specify the entire object at once, and that's just not necessary for us. So we're going to instead implement a newer verb that is supported by HTTP called patch. Patch allows you to send a partial object down and apply it. So here in patch, let's go ahead and try to get the entity that represents the data in the data store or the repository. Let's go ahead and get the diary entry. And here we're still going to need to pass in the identity, the diary ID, and then the ID of the element itself. It's asking for all of these because the ID has to exist inside a diary that is then owned by the current user. If the entity equals null, we can go ahead and do a create response not found. So we can't update it because, as far as we're concerned, it doesn't exist. And this might not exist because the ID isn't there, but it also might be that the ID doesn't exist in that diary, or the diary isn't owned by this person. Now that we have the entity, we're going to want to get the parsed value by calling the model factory.parse to go ahead and get an instance of the entity that contains the data that is new. In our case, the only thing that matters whether it's new or not is if the entity.quantity does not equal the parsed value.quantity. And we're taking a leap of faith here because we're assuming parsed quantity isn't null, so of course let's go ahead and do the same thing we did here, except return a bad request. So if the model factory returned us a bad parsed value, then we're gonna, there I go, we're forgetting return again. We're gonna break out of this method by returning those responses. So now we've gotten to a point where the entity is different. So let's go ahead and say entity.quantity equals parsed value.quantity. Because again, that's really the only value we're gonna support changing or patching. And go ahead and check that the repository save all. And in this case, we can go ahead and say return request.createResponse, and we'll return OK. And then down here, we'll go ahead and just have a fallback. So if the response wasn't OK, we'll go ahead and return request.badRequest. So let's go ahead and build that. And let's go ahead and craft in Fiddler what we need here. Because the quantity is the only thing we really need, let's go ahead and find one of these to update. So let's do this number 15 and update the quantity from 1.5 to 3. There's 15. And if we execute it, we're going to actually get a fail response. That's because we changed the method from put to patch. So let's go ahead and pick patch in here. And it has the same behavior. We're going to need to tell it the content type as well. And now we're going to get a 400 error. Now, why did we get the 400 error? We could debug it, but the reason is that we've assumed that parse here was going to work. Let's walk into parse, and let me show you why it isn't. In parse, we assumed that the URI for measure was going to be valid. We assumed that the measure URL was not going to be blank. But in our case, we don't really need it. So what we're going to want to do is just protect that by saying if model.measureURL, it's not empty or just full of white space, then we can go ahead and parse that. This means that in some cases, in fact, in our case, we're going to attempt to parse it, and we're going to parse it down to not including the food or the measure in cases we don't really need it, like this. Because it's going to parse, it's going to get the quantity, because the quantity is the piece of information we really need. In our case, the rest of the data we need is actually sent here in the URI as the diary ID and the ID of the element we're looking for. The fact that we're not getting the food isn't all that important. We certainly could have a business rule that required the measure ID so that we could make sure it was on the same food, but in this case, I don't think it's that important. Being able to just update the quantity is probably good enough. So now that we've made that change, let's build it and re-execute it. Now we've got the 200. If we go back and look at the data, we should see this turn from 1.5 to 3. We change this to 7.75 and execute it. We can see it's 7.75 now. So we're able to update data using our API using the patch. You may want to support put and patch using the same element. If you want to support put and patch and have one method really handle both of them, the trick there is to actually add attributes. Putting these attributes on the method tell it that these are the two verbs it's going to use. By using the attributes, you're telling it to not infer it by the name, but simply to use the attributes as the designator of what verbs are going to call this method. So if we come back here and change it to put, and of course change the quantity because we have the test in there to only update it if the quantity has been changed, you can see that put also works because we've included the attributes of put and patch on here. So now we have all 4 logical verbs implemented on the diary entries controller. We've got get, post, delete, and put and patch, which are really logically sort of the same operation. Let's talk about paging.